Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SP Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Gemini Moon as a luminary out of Sect, I speak with the brilliant astrologer, Rob Bailey. We spoke about the placement of Rob's moon in the third whole sign house, but also go off on a lot of tangents in this conversation. We discuss Rob's early love of Greek and medieval history, and his journey to discovering astrology as a passion or subject of interest in his late 20s. We also talk about the historical and philosophical tradition of magic. We go on kind of a long tangent about the challenges of practicing horary astrology, as well as the service that particular branch can provide. We also talk about our shared love of Tolkien and the importance of engaging with different myths around the creation of the stars and lights in practicing astrology. Upon reflection, it was a bit ironic and funny how lunar our discussion of the realness or tangibility of certain fictional worlds can be, given the moon's association with imagination and dreams. Rob explains the difference of worldview and cosmology between the medieval world and our modern world, and emphasizes just how important the moon was to the medieval understanding of reality, as well as how they viewed signs in comparison to the more psychologized interpretations prevalent today. We also talked about planets and joy and what it can mean to have one's ascendant ruler in the sixth house. And we talk about the myth of Castor and Pollux, especially as it relates to Rob's relationship with his brother and how the moon in Rob's third plays into that. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on the services I offer. Currently, I'm offering natal and horary consultations in addition to a timing consult that I recently launched. I also offer transcription, captioning, and audio and video editing. Thanks again to all those that have offered their generous support so far. I really appreciate you. Now for my conversation with Rob. I hope you enjoy it. Please be sure to check out the links to his websites and socials below, as well as links to some of the resources that we touch on in our conversation. Okay, Rob Bailey, thank you so much for being on the show with me. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for inviting me on. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've been really enjoying listening to the podcast over the last few months or so, and yeah, sitting here feels really nice. Very much appreciate the invitation. I'm doing well. I'm a bit tired, so I apologize to our listeners if I'm a little bit slower or a bit more scatterbrained than I usually am, because I just traveled to Sydney last night for a concert. And so up a bit late last night and coming back on the bus this morning. So I'm a little bit scatterbrained or a little bit sleepy, but otherwise good. Yeah.
Wonderful. And who'd you go see?
Oh yeah. So I went to see the Wu-Tang Clan and Nas.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah. So they're touring, like they did a show in Auckland a week ago in New Zealand, and now they're touring Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I went with my brother.
Amazing.
And it was great.
First time seeing them?
Yeah, I've never seen them before.
Amazing.
I haven't I'm not much of a consumer of music, or I don't really go to a lot of live music acts.
Same here.
I can count the number of concerts I've been to on the fingers of one hand,
Oh, wow.
So
okay.
It was quite significant that I got out of my little hobbit hole and went off on an adventure. It's like a significant moment for me.
Very cool.
But yeah, because it was such a formative thing for me and my brother growing up. We were very into hip hop music and hip hop culture growing up in the 80s and 90s. And yeah, it was funny, almost nostalgic, or it felt like a good midlife thing to do, as I'm 41 now, to go and see maybe one of the last chances I'll get to see one of my favorite acts, touring, favorite groups, with my brother, who shared my love of that music when we were both teenagers. So it was this fun, kind of bonding moment for me and my brother, and also reminiscing and kind of closing a door or closing a chapter in our lives in a way, which is special. But as a result, there's a lot of emotion in all of that, and also just the excitement and logistics of it all left me feeling a little bit drained.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
I'm getting flashbacks though. I saw the Wu-Tang Clan in a bunch of times, actually. I'm from New York City, so I'm
oh, nice.
and they're from Staten Island. I'm from Queens, And
Yeah.
so I saw them once or twice in high school, and then I saw them at Rock the Bells in like 2008. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was Rage
Right.
Against the
Yeah.
Machine
Oh, nice.
and
Yeah, one of
Wu-Tang
my favorite
Clan.
groups. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was just
Yeah.
like amazing, amazing show. So I'm having like flashbacks to being like I was a teenager at that point, like late in high school. Yeah. So interesting. Great memories.
Mm,
Glad
mm.
that you had a good time. Did you have any like travel issues with Mercury retrograde or anything like that?
It was actually pretty smooth. We did sort of wander around the short distance travel, I would say. Like the more third house form of travel was more problematic because we got a little bit lost trying to get to the arena, even though I booked a hotel room very close to the venue. We
Mm-hmm.
ended up kind of like milling around, a bit confused until we figured out which way to go. So, but that was the only kind of Mercury retrograde issue that we ran into. It's actually very smooth, it turned
Yeah.
out. So yeah.
Not too bad. Not too bad
Hmm.
as Mercury retrograde can go.
For sure. Yeah.
Wonderful. Rob, can you give us a brief introduction to yourself, to your practice? I know you're a student of history and philosophy. I would love to hear about your
Mm.
philosophical perspective on astrology, and then just a little bit about like your teachers, how you got into astrology, who's influenced you.
Yeah, sure. I could talk about this for hours, and
Mm,
I'll try and give you like the more succinct version. But so before I was really into astrology, my interest was always in history, and that's been with me since I can remember, like since I was a little kid. Some of my earliest
mm,
memories are like pouring through the library shelves. I was very interested in like ancient Greece in particular. For some reason, that just sort of caught my imagination. The mythology and also just the history of the period as well fascinated me. So I remember going through bookshelves in the library, pouring through them, looking for anything with the word ancient Greece on it that had a few
mm,
pictures in it, because I was still a kid at the end of the day. I would I would get those books out, and so that's been with me all my life. Interest in ancient history and medieval history. And then another really influential person that kind of led me to where I am now in terms of studying astrology, etc., was when I was in what we call college in my town, but it's like year 11 and year 12, like the senior years of high school, essentially.
mm, mm,
I did a course on philosophy. It was like an elective unit you could take. And they were only offering it to people who were in like the quote unquote gifted and talented program, which I had the pleasure of being part of. And
uh,
so I got to go to the philosophy class, which at the time it was called Theory of Knowledge,
mm,
which was this really esoteric like title. I didn't know what that really meant, but I thought
mm,
it sounded like, interesting, and was just fascinated by it. And like my teacher at the time, Pam Garrett, who's passed away, like rest in peace, Pam, but she
mm.
was really influential on me. Like the first things we learned about were like Platonism, and she kind of took us through chronologically through the history of philosophy
Yeah.
in a very like engaging way. Because we weren't being marked on it, wasn't going towards our final grades or anything like that. She was very creative with how she taught it, and we did like circles. We'd sit around in circles and like talk about
Mm-hmm.
our
Seminar
ideas.
style philosophy
Yeah,
class. Yeah.
yeah, it was like a philosophy circle or something. It was really cool.
Mm,
And it was like once a week we just meet up, and very different like vibe, I suppose, to your standard high school class, sitting in
mm,
a circle and talking about whether we agree with Plato or something like that. That was
yeah.
really formative. And I never really lost the love of philosophy from that point forward, even after I graduated high school and went on to uni and things. And when I was out in the workforce, I still would check back in with the Greek philosophers. I was particularly enamored with the Greek philosophers.
Mm,
So I own like the sort of like the Penguin Classics editions of all the Plato's works, like the sort of popular versions that are available in bookshops. I've got
mm.
a whole shelf just full of them because over the years I would just pick up. I think I have all of Plato's dialogues pretty much, and if I see one
Yeah, it
that I
was
don't
just
have, I'll be like annoyed and I'll buy it.
I was just looking
um,
around on my bookshelf, like, where's my complete works of Plato?
right? Yeah, I should
It's
probably
it's
just got the complete
it's on the
works to
other
save
side.
myself some trouble. I got
Hmm.
them all individually, like one at a time.
Well, it's interesting because I know some people who
Yeah.
are very are very like, you need to have this particular edition or this
Mm,
particular translation of the Republic for it to be like a legitimate reading of the Republic. Like you need
okay.
Alan Bloom's edition or something like that, which
Mm.
it's getting a little in the weeds there, but
Well, as from studying a lot of astrology textbooks really closely and see the differences between different translators and things, I can see how someone would
yeah,
would get to that point where they are
that is
like
very true.
splitting hairs, like this person's translation is better because A, B, and C, or like a casual reader like myself wouldn't really understand the nuance of that. But I can certainly see how you would get to that level of discernment with philosophy, that those differences would make a difference. It's funny you mentioned the translation thing, because I think one thing that I picked up a love for from reading the Penguin Classics translations of like Plato and a bunch of other, like I just expanded out into like the Roman authors as well. So I was reading a lot of like translations from Latin just for fun, like before I go to bed at night. And that's my idea of fun anyway. Not my wife's idea of fun, but my idea of fun. And one thing that I love, and I think has carried through to the astrology work that I'm doing now, is I loved reading the introductions, the translator's introduction. And I really enjoyed reading about the choices they would make about like how to like translate a particular Greek word into English. So that there'd be a bunch of technical terms in philosophy that don't really translate well, and they'd have to make these choices.
Right.
And I loved, for some reason, like my brain just really enjoyed grappling with this idea of like, how do you transmute an idea from one language to another in an effective way, and what are some of the ways that English has like pitfalls, strengths and weaknesses. That just fascinated me. And then so you can see how this set me up. Like even at this point, I was not really interested in astrology or anything esoteric really at all, but I was fascinated by history, fascinated by philosophy. And I think what I needed to become who I am now, in terms of being obsessed with esoterica and astrology, is to get the philosophical and historical version of it. I needed to see that I needed to find the door, if you like, in the history museum or whatever that led to the esoterica section, and then now you've got me hooked, because my experiences of astrology up until my late 20s, when I became interested in the subject, were very passing, and it was just like looking at sun sign columns in the newspaper, or my parents had a book about sun signs that would sit on the shelf and gather dust, and it never really struck me as particularly interesting, or that there was much there, because I didn't really, my self-perception was not someone who was interested in things that I considered to be like new agey, or like woo woo, or the sort of typical like way that you put subjects into like a basket, like for your own mental convenience.
Heuristics.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah. I'm like, that's all just the stuff that I don't do. That's for people who wear crystals and things, and that wasn't my self-image. You know what I mean? But what actually turned me onto it was I was dating a girl who was into like Wicca and into tarot and these subjects, right? And I was just obsessed. I was obsessed with her, and I thought she was amazing, and I wanted to like understand her better. I suppose I wanted to really connect, because this stuff meant a lot to her. Like this stuff, sort of quote unquote, like again, I'm putting it all into this big. We tend to do this sometimes. We put like astrology into this pot with like tarot and crystals and other things that that you find at like the store that smells like incense in the mall,
right? Yeah, some people could call that like a cult, and then some people, or esoterica, and some people could call that fringe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's funny how it all gets lumped together in a way where you associate it all as one thing, or if you're into one thing, you assume that you're into everything else, but it's actually much more nuanced. Of course, we know that we're on an astrology podcast right now, but little old me at the time, I had no idea. But yeah, so I had this girlfriend, and I really wanted to get in touch with her, and that led me to go to the library, and I was like, I'll find a book about astrology, that so that I can like learn a little bit about it and be more conversant with her about it. And while I was poking around in there, I found a book on the history of astrology, right? And that was like, perfect. I was like, this is it. Like, I can read this. This is going to be interesting to me because I love history. And when I'm finished with the book, I'll have some stuff I can like, some conversation topics or something I can raise with my girlfriend, and so that sounds great. So I got the book out, and pretty quickly was just like super fascinated with it. Pretty quickly. Like, it didn't take long for me to, even the opening chapters of the book, and the book was Jim Tester's book, It's called A History of Western Astrology or something like that.
Okay.
Like he deliberately called it A History because he felt like it wasn't the definitive history; it was his version.
Love that.
Interesting book. It's still available. He's a bit hostile to astrology. Like he's a skeptic, but he dedicated his life to studying the history of it.
Interesting.
And he wrote it when he was dying, so it was like his sort of swan song. It's kind of a sad book to read when you read the introduction and you recognize that what was happening in Mr. Tester's life when he wrote that book. So anyway, it had a huge influence on me. So at least, you know, his life's work, if you like, had it influenced people, you know. Even the first few chapters where he was just discussing the basics of the astronomy, and he started with like the Greek material and then moved through chronologically. I was fascinated, and I had to sort of stop and think about things because I didn't really want to proceed with this is the thoroughness that I have. I'm a very thorough person, like so. I couldn't understand some of the diagrams initially because it was describing astronomical things, like just simple things like the ecliptic and the rotation of the Earth and the way that it makes the stars, you know, all that sort of basic stuff that you have to learn to be able to grok astrology. It confused me initially, but instead of just sort of glossing over it and continuing with the book, I just sat down and visualized it all, like spent a lot of time like mentally visualizing like a spinning orb.
You, like, did the math.
Yeah, like to really grasp it, you know, and that process engaged me a lot because I was like doing a bit of extracurricular work to understand the book, you know, and so I'm engaged and flicking through and yeah, was blown away. There was a section on the medieval translation movement where all the texts, well, so many texts about astrology and magic were translated from Arabic into Latin, and there's a section in the book where he lists all the different names of all the authors and all the different texts that they translated. This huge long list and all these like funny sounding Latin transliterations of Arabic names like Albumasa or like Zahel. And these names just seemed like something you'd find written on like a wizard's book in like a Dungeons and Dragons game or something like that. It fascinated me, you know, because I was interested in like fantasy stuff like D&D, video games. So to encounter like something that seemed very magical but was real and actually happened,
like real people in the medieval, like in medieval times, were like wizards.
Yeah,
literally, like they. That was their job.
That blew me away, right? Because I just had no idea that was a thing. Like, I just assumed that, like, you know, these figures like Merlin or whatever were like, I don't know, cultural artifacts. I didn't understand that archetype of like the court wizard or something is based on a reality. Like that blew my mind. And the one thing in particular that got me out of all the things in that book that sort of sunk their claws into me, there's a lot of things in that book that sunk their claws into me, was this really passing reference to the Picatrix, really passing, like it was like a footnote or something. He's talking about the church. It was something about the church having concerns about astrology or something. And then mentioned like, you know, grimoires and things. And there was this little footnote talking about the Picatrix and how that was like a, you know, very hardcore grimoire, you know, that had astrological material in it. And the author, I can't remember the exact, I don't actually own the book. I'm just coming from memory now, that he had some sort of remark that this was like really quite dark stuff. And I think he might have mentioned like Agrippa in passing as well. And when I read that, I was just like, hold on a minute, there's real magical book. Because I had no idea that there was a real history and tradition of people earnestly practicing magic. I thought it was, you know, stage magicians and then like, and people trying to rip you off. Like I had no idea that there was a real historical tradition of people earnestly practicing magic. And that blew my mind to learn that. And that sort of started me on that transitioned me very gradually at first from being interested in this subject sort of like intellectually, and because I wanted to like talk about it with my girlfriend, to like, maybe I want to like learn more about this. And that led me to, I think pretty soon after I read that, I did like a Google search for like the Picatrix. And this was like back in 2006, 2007. And there wasn't a lot of information out there on the internet about it, but probably the very top of the Google search results from memory would have been Chris Warnock's website, Renaissance Astrology. Yeah, and that sort of started, that was the beginning.
Yeah, I just want to say really quickly, I studied philosophy in college and university.
Oh, and awesome. Yeah.
I'm recalling this moment right now where my ethics professor made a comment about the magical tradition of knowledge, which
Mm.
I've obviously come to know a little bit more about, but like kind of this person, I'm just recalling this person who was like within the academy, had a doctorate in philosophy, had some kind of like recognition or legitimacy
Mm.
philosophically,
Mm.
acknowledging that there was a magical tradition with
Mm.
some kind of like hint of affirmation of that. But it's really interesting how at this point in the academy, in reference to philosophy in particular, there's not a lot of acknowledgement of the effect of that on the history of philosophy, the history of ideas. And I do feel like that's like I'm excited to continue my learning into that and continue my learning of how that overlaps with philosophy and the history of philosophy, because I imagine, as I'm studying astrology and learning more about the magical tradition, I'm seeing that there has been a profound impact.
Mm. Yeah, I think there's a
Yeah.
huge amount of work that needs to be done, and we can see there's work by people like Lynn Thorndike and things that we're starting to, I think that one of them, the first people that I came across that were doing that kind of work of thinking about, well, let's examine these figures from the Renaissance that um we tend to see as like weirdos, magical off to the side doing their magical practices are actually like really important for the history of science and things. And they were doing work. I think there's some interesting work from the history of science perspective on um, astrology and magic, but there's certainly room for more. And I think joining the dots up to the present day is something that's really fascinating as well. Like following the strands right up to where we are today isn't, I'd love to read more work, and I'm sure there's a whole generation of people who are preparing some really
Mm-hmm.
interesting academic work about how these things all tie together. We're in a
Yeah.
kind of a exciting time. It's a cool time to be studying astrology and practicing astrology actually, because I don't think there's ever been more like greater number of intelligent people who are dedicating themselves to digging out even more secrets and more information about these topics. So there's like a wealth of, we're almost spoiled for choice in terms of
Yeah.
what to read and what to consume right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not to say that the academy is the end all be all, or that
No,
that kind of like getting a master's degree or getting a PhD is like the goal, or
no,
puts those people above anybody. But there is a lot of people, I think, developing strong degrees of expertise in subjects to
for
really
sure.
be able to contribute and, yeah, elucidate and serve the community through increasing our base of knowledge.
Something that my teacher, Chris Warnock, said to me that's resonated with me for many years is that he said, I don't want to make my students into academics,
Mm-hmm.
but I do want my students to be academic in their approach to astrology, which I thought was like a cool, like, way of putting it. And there's some nuance in what he's saying there.
Yeah.
Um, like Christopher Warnock was such a great influence. One thing I took from Christopher Warnock was always citing my sources.
Mm.
So if you get a reading from me, even if you don't know anything about astrology or have any interest in it, you're going to be subject to a written a written response that's going to cite sources to books that you've probably never heard of before. But I do that because I want to be able to look back at it and remember where,
Mm-hmm.
where was I getting that from,
Yeah.
um and also because a lot of people who get readings from me are students and they are
Mm-hmm.
interested in, not just the answer but how I got there.
Right.
um so Christopher Warnock is, oh yeah, he drums that into you, like cite your sources, like don't just say things,
Mm-hmm.
but I want to know where you're getting that from.
Mm.
uh, and that's just baked into my approach now. Like I do it as a habit.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wonder. I was actually corresponding with you yesterday about a horary interpretation that I was doing, because I
Mm.
had this particular issue that came up that I didn't quite know how to deal with, or didn't know quite what it meant, and you were able to we were able to talk about that and get some kind of elucidation and understanding. And I wrote that interpretation today, and I probably quoted Saul from like 5 or 10 different places. And
Yeah.
so I really value that as well. And I wonder if it's because coming into astrology a year ago now, came on the tail of me being in a grad program for a year
Mm.
in
Mm.
urban planning. So like very different field, but any field basically, so any social science field, I feel like there's going to be a strong emphasis on strong research methods and writing
Mhm.
papers properly. And that was a strength I had in that program. And I haven't continued that program. I stopped after a year because I didn't feel like it was for me. And I kind of picked up astrology and have been really, really rolling learning astrology for the last year. But it's good to hear that resonance. Because
Mm.
I think that citing sources is really important. And it's interesting that you bring up Christopher Warnock. Like, of course you will, because he is your teacher. But I think another thing that you share with Christopher Warnock, in addition to the kind of academic rigor that you bring to your practice, is a real generosity. Because yesterday was not the first time that we corresponded about like horary technique. And I've also corresponded with Chris. I'm like corresponding with like all of these. I've never met Christopher Warnock, but I've written him a bunch of emails,
Yeah.
and he's like, when I was doing my What Makes an Astrologer series, he was like sending me emails about like notes on my methodology and stuff like that, and
Yeah. Cool.
which is just like, it feels incredible to be able to communicate and talk with someone who has like literally decades of experience, who's
Mm.
like, I think that you should do this, and is like encouraging and stuff like that. And I like to give context for listeners for how I know my guests, because I think it can inform where we're coming from in the conversation. And you're actually like my horary teacher. And so part of why I've been corresponding with you here and there is because I know you from, you kind of like teaching me horary astrology along with Chris Brennan. So I just wanted to give a shout out to you and the generosity that you bring to like your practice and to the community. And just want to say thank you for that. And like, thank you for being here again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. That's very kind of you, and I appreciate those words. That means a lot to me. I always feel very humbled to even be in a position to teach this material.
Mm.
And yeah, very very honored to have you on the journey with me and Chris. Yeah, I was just reflecting that I probably ought to explain to our listeners who aren't familiar with me precisely what I do, just because we're already getting a little bit into the depths of things here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been practicing astrology on and off, studying and practicing on and off since 2007, 2008. At the moment, actually, for some reason, all throughout my career as an astrologer, for some reason, I seem to be focusing on horary astrology. I'm not
Mm.
quite sure what it is.
Mm.
Um, I think it's just happenstance, honestly. That it's just been such a focus of mine. Because initially, like I said, I got into astrology to make talismans and be a magician. But
Mm-hmm.
that thoroughness kind of crept in a bit, and I started with horary astrology because I was under the impression at the time that was what you had to do. That was the right way to study traditional astrology, was to start with horary.
Mm.
So I started with it, but then I never really felt I fully mastered it. So I've just stuck with it for like,
Yeah.
14 years or something, 15 years, because I'm still not satisfied that I've completely mastered it. And I'm not sure that I ever will. So I'm starting to wonder whether I ought to just move on and be sat and just be content with that feeling of that there's always a new page to turn. But
Mm.
so I practice primarily horary astrology. I also in the past and hopefully in the future will offer natal readings as well. But at the moment, horary astrology is my bread and butter, and I offer readings. I'm also, as you mentioned, preparing a course with Chris Brennan, the legendary Chris Brennan,
Mm-hmm.
which is currently available for I suppose you call it early access, so people can
Mm-hmm.
purchase the course now, and it's sort of a work in progress. We're uploading a new lecture every month or so, and hopefully we'll complete the course and have it finished by the end of the year. Fingers crossed, we shall see.
Mm-hmm.
But that's who I am, so your listeners are aware.
Yeah. I want people to pay you guys what you're worth, because
Mm,
I think it's going to be a really amazing course, and it already is.
mm,
But you're kind of grandfathering people in. And so I'll definitely encourage listeners to like go and get into the course now before the price like jumps up. because it's like really a steal. I don't know why. Like I feel like you guys should raise the price already, but I'm not,
Yeah,
you know.
I wonder whether we ought to have that. We should get Diana on a three-way call with me and Chris. You know? Sorry,
Diana will.
Diana Harper is sorry. She's been yelling at me on Twitter to increase my prices, and very effectively as well. I
Yeah.
did end up increasing my prices in response. So that's the context for that remark. But we
Mhm.
should. I wonder if as especially as we're now 4 or 5 video lectures in, it might be smart to increase the price a little bit, just given there's more content there than there was a few months ago. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I
but
do have a
yeah,
quick question for you about horary because I'm really curious about it.
sure.
If you mind just going on a little tangent
Mm-hmm.
for a moment, I think that horary compared to natal, and as my natal practice is like developing, I'm finding it to be a lot more predictive. So a lot more either you're right or you're wrong, kind of. But I think that there can be a very gray or interpretive element with natal that
Mm-hmm.
horary is a little bit less forgiving, where you kind of like are right or you're wrong. And I think that this, and also like the stakes can generally be pretty high. Sometimes you have people coming with really heavy questions that they
Yeah.
feel like they really need answers to. And so in a way, horary is like, it's kind of a simple practice that it's fundamentally the kind of structure of it is can be somewhat simple, but you know, then you obviously the details can get very complex, but it's very hard. It's a
Yeah.
very hard thing. And so I'm curious if the concreteness of it and the data of it, because I know Christopher Warnock has talked about this as well, where he's just like, I give an interpretation, I say whether it's going to be yes or no, I get feedback on that, I know whether I was right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very, in some ways, it's out of all the branches of astrology, maybe this is not true, but I feel like out of the different branches of astrology, it's the most like edge of your seat kind of astrology. You know what I mean? Like
Mm,
you're taking a risk with
mm,
every reading. You're staking your reputation essentially
mm,
every single time you pull a chart for someone,
mm.
because there's less room to hide. You're right. Like there's
Yeah.
something I want to be careful about how I say this, because I don't want to appear at all disparaging to people who practice natal astrology as their primary or indeed all that they do, because it's actually, if you look at the medieval authors and the way they thought about astrology, they felt that it's quite the opposite. You know, today we're sitting here
Mm-hmm.
talking about how hard horary is. Like this is the hard stuff. But Bonatti says that horary is the easy peasy thing, and natal
Mm,
astrology is way harder. And um, there's other authors in the early modern period as well, like Elias Ashmole, who disparaged astrologers who could only do horary astrology, and he said that
mm-hmm.
that's, you know, putting words in his mouth. But he's like, that's child's play compared to doing natal astrology, doing like solar returns and progressions and primary direction, and
Right.
that's
All those
that's the
techniques.
advanced material, right? And today
Right.
we have it sort of flipped on its head, where people tend to study natal astrology first, and then later on they encounter horary and they're like, wow, this is really difficult. Whereas like in the medieval period, people would start with horary and then move on to natal astrology and then be like, wow, this natal astrology is difficult. So
Mm,
it's funny how different astrology is just in general. Not so much technically, but in our whole approach and the way we think about astrology is different to the way it was in the Middle Ages, you know, in the early
mm,
period. Because yeah, we just have a different orientation,
yeah.
and that brings a lot of it makes our perspective quite different. Yeah, it's something I think about a lot. You're right though. Like, to get back to your point, there's something about horary that requires you to be kind of brave, a little bit brave. I'm reminded of something that I think it was Girolamo Cardano said.
Mm-hmm.
That being an astrologer requires you to be a bit bold. Like you have to kind
Mm,
of have a bit of courage and self confidence to even hang up the shingle
right.
and start issuing judgments, particularly this kind of predictive horary astrology, where if someone comes to you with a question and it could be almost anything, and then you're supposed to turn around and give them an answer in pretty quick fashion. it's edge of your seat stuff, and you never really know when you open up the email like what's going to be in there. Like the question could be something pretty, relatively low stakes, like I met this person at work and they seem really cute, like is there a future there for us, to like things that are really really heavy, life
Yeah.
or death topics, and or questions that are so loaded with emotional,
Yeah.
like I don't know what the word is. Like you can tell that this is a high stakes question for someone, and your answer will be transformative for them one way or the other. Um, with natal astrology, there is more room to explore. Like the question is so focused. I think this is it's an issue of scope. The question is very narrow in focus. So a
Right.
horary question will be like something like, for example, I've had questions like this, and I continue to get them, and they're very scary when you get them. Will I ever be in a happy relationship?
Oh my God.
Or like, will I ever have children? Things like that. Where there's like a huge amount of emotional, like a lot of thought has been put into that question. That's a question they've carried in their heart for much longer than a day or two. They've probably carried that for years,
Yeah.
and they're finally voicing that to you. And it's your job to be the voice of the unity of the cosmos.
Right.
You're meant to like peer and sort of poke, like the Flammarion, engraving. You're meant to kind of peer behind the gears of the universe and come back and tell them what the answer is to that. That's a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
And it's confronting. When I first started doing horary, I had to actually stop because I found that what I found, this is getting a bit real, was that telling people no and giving them negative answers was starting to really bum me out.
Yeah.
I didn't like being the messenger.
Right.
And I became quite sort of, it put me in a dark mental place where I started to realize, or I started to think, I think this is probably a negative way of thinking about things, but I started to think people have really unrealistic hopes and goals for their lives, and my job is to shoot them down. And that started to just depress me. So I took a few years off actually and stopped doing horary for a while because it was draining me. And I'm a bit more resilient now, and I think I've come back with a more stoic kind of perspective on things. I've done a bit more life, I've done a bit more living, and I've done a bit more reading and sort of a bit more mature perspective perhaps. But it still is hard. It still takes an emotional toll to tell someone, no, you're not going to have a child. No, you're not going to find someone. That's hard. But besides all of that, there's also just the fact that someone will come back and tell you were wrong, or like the fear of being told that you're wrong is powerful. When you're a natal astrologer and someone comes to you for a year ahead reading, for example, you might say 5 or 6 different things to different themes that might come up depending on their progressions or their perfections. You just look at the house meanings, children, siblings, you pick it, and then they'll come back to you and say, well, you were right about this, 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 and this, and that makes you feel good. Like I got some things right. I didn't get all of it right, but I got some things right. It's good enough. You get that.
If you get like 50% of that right, you did pretty good. But if you get, there's no 50% right with horary, really.
Yeah. Or people will get disappointed. Like, they'll ask will X ever happen? And if so, when? And you get the first part right, but you don't get the when right. You don't get the timing right. And then to them, they're like, well, you didn't get it right. It's all or nothing,
Yeah.
So there is that, like, it's high stakes. It is edge of your seat stuff. And you have to either be predisposed to being okay with that, or you have to come, like me, you have to kind of come to a place of being like the temperature of the water. You can handle it,
Yeah. I think for me, the saving grace so far, because I was counting the number of questions I've answered today, and I've answered about 40 in the last 6 months or so since you gave me that certification for completing the horary class. And I've had a lot of people say, like, I didn't like that you told me no, but you have a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if everybody I tell no feels that way. And I feel like I almost have to be like, hey, you're going to ask me a question and I'm going to perhaps tell you no. Are you ready to hear that? I feel like I almost have to start bringing that in as a preamble.
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
I mean, there are people I've given interpretations to, never heard back from them, don't know
Mhm.
how they received it or not. But there have been enough people who have been like, I really appreciated that. You were right. I really appreciated the way that you communicated about it.
Mm.
And that's
That's this.
meaningful.
Yeah.
It
It's.
sucks to say no, but it is meaningful that I can at least give someone the quote unquote right answer in a way that they can receive.
Mhm. It's like a public service or something that you do. Honestly, I sometimes feel that way, and a
Mm.
lot of times people will. What I found is that the ones that I'm the most anxious about delivering the no answer to, oftentimes the person is very actually receptive to it.
Mm.
And you find that people who ask those really heavy questions have come to a place where they're ready for, they're not going to the oracle with one, hoping for one outcome. Like they're happy to know, not happy perhaps, but they're ready to hear either yes or no. And they're
Yeah.
not, even if it's upsetting for them, they just need to know one way or the other. And
Mm.
they've come to that place.
Mm.
And I feel like that's when as long as they're in that mindset, then usually, and if you're kind and compassionate in the way you deliver your answer, then usually people don't get mad at you or upset with you or anything like that.
Mm.
And they usually, and they're often quite grateful,
Yeah.
because you were real with them. Like I had a guy who I remember I did a reading for him, and he had this very hopeful question, I remember, and I had said no to him. It was something like, oh, it was something quite heartfelt, and I told him no, and he came back for another reading, and he said specifically that it was because I said no to him and was just truthful,
Yeah.
that he came back.
Mm-hmm.
So we can get we can do our own heads in a little bit as astrologers, especially in this weird world of horary, like worrying about if giving someone a negative response is going to turn them off.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the integrity, people value the integrity more than anything else.
Yeah.
So so if you have integrity and you're just prepared to stand by your work, even if it's not what someone wants to hear,
Mm-hmm.
then that will keep you in good stead. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. I feel like we
Mm.
could talk about horary for probably another two
Yeah,
hours.
for
So
sure. Yeah, maybe when I transition into like the talking about the luminaries, and
yeah.
because we had a lot to have a lot to talk about in terms of my Gemini moon, which we can shift. Although it's funny, I think all my talkativeness and everything is part of that, perhaps.
Yeah. And the fun
Yeah.
thing too is like I feel like we're having a really depthful kind of touching conversation in some ways already.
Mm.
Even though we're not even really haven't even really gotten to the conversation. We have these opposite moons because I have a Sag moon. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I feel like there is this kind of bouncing off of each other a little bit in terms of like, yeah, intellectualizing and like meaning making and
Hmm.
emotional and whatnot. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
My
it's
wife has a Sagittarius moon as well, and I feel like the opposite moon signs can really feed off each other in that way. There can be that like electricity sometimes between
mhm.
the this polar, the signs that have a are on those axes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your childhood and your relationship with the moon at that time.
Sure.
And if you
Yeah.
didn't like have like a moon practice when you were a kid, what's like one memory that comes to mind in relation to the moon?
I think like a lot of people, one of my first memories was just looking at the moon out of a moving car,
Mm.
probably coming back from a family dinner or something like that, and just noticing the moon sort of seeming to follow the car and asking my parents like why it does that, and my dad trying to explain that to me,
Hmm.
um, and me probably getting bored and not listening. But yeah, I think I had a standard kind of level of curiosity about astronomy and the things happening in the sky that most children have. Like it's fascinating and it's beautiful,
Yeah.
and you become curious about it. But then it becomes normal and mundane, and as you grow up and your attention switches to other things. But I still recall being young and curious and filled with
Hmm.
wonder about things like, why is the moon following us along, and things like that. But yeah, I would say my interest in the stars and celestial things when I was younger was probably typical of a young boy my age, and quite sort of scientific in a way. I was interested in science and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad was always really big on introducing me to like science and maths, and we're quite intellectual house. Like we were lower middle class, but my parents both completed university, and they were kind of intellectual people. Like we'd always have like the radio. When the radio was on, it would always be like it would be either classical music, or it would be one of those like channels where people just discuss like books and things like that. Like it wasn't like pop music in the
Right.
house. And so like when it came to like looking at the stars and things, it would always be through that like intellectualized kind of way. Like let's get okay, you want to know about the stars, here's a book about like astronomy and things like that. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't sort of more it was it wasn't like an intuitive relationship or understanding. Like my parents tend to intellectualize things,
Right.
So some of my early memories would be just reading books
Mm-hmm.
about astronomy or space and things like that when I was a kid, because that was the portal.
Mm.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your notes that and you mentioned earlier that you were into D&D and like kind of wanted to become a wizard and stuff like that. And you mentioned in your notes Tolkien, and I was curious if your dad got you into Tolkien.
Yes, that was my father. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
my dad too. I've actually been reading the Silmarillion recently, and we don't have to go off on too much of a tangent, but I've been thinking about like wanting to have like a astrology and Tolkien conversation with someone, because it is so like Tolkien is such a student of folklore, it seems.
Yes.
And he has this like I was walking around my neighborhood with my partner the other day, and we were talking about I was telling her about the myth that he creates of the creation of the sun and the moon, which are basically the trees in Valinor where the gods are, and the trees get killed, and one fruit comes off of one of the trees and one flower comes off of the other trees, and the gods turn the fruit and the flower into the sun and the moon, and they're gods, Maiar, in this kind of universe, who guide them. And it's just a really beautiful story, and it got me thinking about how important it is just to engage with myth, and different cultural myths around, especially like the creation of the lights, the creation of the stars or the planets or what have you, because it can, I think, add so much depth and so much meaning. It's just really interesting to see how astrological a lot of Tolkien's writing is, having now read it as an adult who's like an astrology student.
Be interesting to go back and read some of those things again, like with the perspective I have now. I will say, yeah. I mean, Tolkien was a huge influence on me. My father was very into it and encouraged / forced me to read the Lord of the Rings when I was probably about 9 years old or 10 years old, so quite young.
Yeah.
But as a result, it was very formative, and it's kind of seeped into my blood and bones in some ways, like some of those lines and songs from those books. And I do think there's an overlap there between an interest in fantasy and an interest in astrology and esoterica, and beyond just the obvious one of like, well, there's wizards and magic and things like that. I think also there's just the love of the mysterious, and something I really enjoyed about Tolkien's work, I think everyone who's encountered it can attest to if they enjoyed it, was it felt there's a depth to it. And there was I've never encountered a fantasy world that felt more, not so much real, but more like just fleshed out and had a lot of depth and lore to it, that didn't feel like it was made up hurriedly. It felt like it had some age to it. And you didn't get the feeling that he was just coming up with things like a fantasy author might go, who am I going to call this elf, or what's a funny sounding word for Flaffion or something like that. Well, that Tolkien had created an entire language and thought about it for a long time, and so when he names a character, it's not ephemeral. There's a lot of thought going into everything, and it felt very crafted and in a masterly way.
A great example of that is, again, to go back to the story of the creation of the sun and the moon. The moon is called Isil, and the sun is called Anar. And then the kings of Gondor later on, like the ancestors of Aragorn, are named Isildur and Anarion. So
Mm,
literally, like
mm,
there's a reference to the moon and the sun in both of their names. And
yeah.
there's just this real intentionality. And I was actually thinking about this. No shade to the Dune heads out there, but I got to book for it. I got into book 4 of the Dune series, and I was just like, this is too much. This is harried was really like the term that came to mind. It's like
Yeah.
feels like this guy's just kind of making shit up as he goes.
Yeah.
Whereas like the more I read
Yeah.
Tolkien's body of work, the more I feel like, wow, there was like a real world here that was very intentionally crafted, or like perhaps like inherited somehow.
Mm,
People can talk about like Tolkien kind of channeling this world or receiving this kind of world.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's something about the reality, like there is a reality to it, isn't there? Like because he lingered on it so long and spent so much of his life working on it and thinking about it and adding to it, that it does feel in a weird way like a real place,
Yeah.
like in a way that other fantasy worlds don't. I'm not sure if I can articulate it better than that, but there's something about Middle Earth where when people discuss it and talk about it, it's it has a presence,
Mm.
um that like it's almost yeah, like in that way that it's also magic making. It's something's been woven in that man's
Hmm.
mind
Uh,
that has
mm.
taken on a reality that is greater than, I don't know. It's
Yeah.
beyond imagination. It's transitioned out of that imaginal space and into something else. Yeah,
Mm. I'm
yeah.
reminded a little bit of like the clause course that I got into a little bit a while back, where it's like the general idea I just want to point to is like, if you think of an idea enough, if enough people think of an idea,
Mm,
that thing somehow becomes real on some level,
yeah.
even if it
Yeah.
doesn't have physical tangibility.
Mm. There's
Yeah.
something to that, right? Or like I think about other worlds that have just become incredibly resonant with people, like 100 Acres Wood, like Winnie the Pooh or something like that. Like that,
Mm.
there's a that's a place that people
Mm.
have like so many children have visited in their imaginations for
Yeah.
decades and decades, and the characters that live there. And I think there's a self awareness from the author as well when those, like if you've read the books, like when they end, there's this feeling of like saying goodbye to a place that's real but you can't go back to, or Neverland, I
Mm.
suppose, as well. Like the probably that's the most on the nose version of this would
Yeah.
be the Peter Pan story. Like yeah,
Mm.
there's a very self aware version of that. Like Peter Pan is extraordinarily self aware about this place is real, but you can only be here when you're a child and you can't come back if you leave. Like
Mm.
that's yeah, and the way that the adults have this dim memory of it, like maybe
Mm.
I visited there once. I can't quite remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's potent. It's potent, this stuff.
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. I mean, to return to the moon, what does the moon mean to you today? And why do you think it's important for us to talk about the moon or focus on the moon when we're talking about astrology or, practicing astrologically?
It's so important, isn't it, really? I
Yeah.
feel I feel like if I had to pick one planet and say that's the most important planet in astrology, it would easily be the moon,
Hmm.
without a doubt. Um uh there's something vital about the moon in this system of astrology, but also just like intuitively, apart from the sun, it's the most obvious and noticeable celestial body,
Right.
and the sun is so regular in its movement that we take it
Mm.
for granted. But the moon has this unpredictable quality that makes
Mm.
it exciting and different. And so, like looking at the sky and seeing the sun every day is comforting, because you're like, oh well, there it is, and it's always going to be there. But when you see the moon in the sky, it's like, oh, there's the moon. It's like it's unusual, and you see it during the day. People comment on, oh look, the moon. I can see the moon during the day today.
Right.
When it's a full moon, ordinary people are like, wow, did you see the moon outside tonight? So there's a striking quality to it, and that just lends itself immediately to astrology, because astrology is essentially the interpretation of something striking. It's a
Mm.
divinatory method. When something happens that's that piques our curiosity, or that grabs us symbolically. It speaks to us immediately. Like a painting falling off if a painting of your loved one falls off the shelf, you would immediately think, oh no, is something going to happen to my loved one? That the resonance of an event around you, well, there's nothing more impactful and striking than seeing the moon in the sky. It's one of the most like visually like striking things that you encounter as a human being, you know. But getting to the actual astrology of it, I just wanted to mention that there's like an intuitive or like felt component to this as well. It's not just intellectual, it's like deep in our sort of guts. And you know, the moon is crucial to everything we do in astrology. And I think it comes down to, we have to remember the worldview of the people that created astrology or that discovered astrology, however you want to, whichever way you want to go with that. The moon was the sphere of the moon encapsulated the earth, you know. We forget the way that people envisaged the cosmos in this time. We're very much like victims in a way of the worldview that we have, where it's difficult for us to put ourselves into the mindset of medieval people or people from the ancient world, how they viewed the cosmos. So we're trying to take modern cosmology and modern worldview and then just pick up astrology and run with it. But that's not, you're going to get funny results that way. It's better in a way to take the mental effort to put yourself in the worldview of a medieval ancient person, and then pick up the astrology, and then you have more sympathy for the material, you know, and you understand it a little bit better. You made that mental effort. So, you know, when you think about the fact that there's all this stuff happening in the sky, all the different, like the planets, the stars, and you know, from the medieval perspective, we have this sort of set of spheres, almost like Russian nesting dolls,
right,
with the Earth in the middle, and then out from the Earth, the first sphere is the moon, and then there's a sphere for Mercury, a sphere for Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the final sphere in the medieval cosmos is the fixed stars. Then beyond that is sometimes they have a sphere for the zodiac itself, and then the prima mobile, so the final sphere that turns everything, the first mover. And so from that perspective, the sphere of the moon is like it's like the underwear of the Earth or something like that. It's like it's the closest layer, you know what I mean? It's the closest
something
layer
very intimate.
Yeah. And everything else before it reaches the Earth, it has to pass through all of those spheres, and the final layer that something has to pass through before it can reach the Earth is the lunar sphere. And in the medieval world, it was very common to think about astrology as causal and the planets as having an influence. And even if we distance ourselves from that kind of thinking, it permeates medieval and Renaissance astrology so much that you can't really distance yourself from it. You can't escape that kind of thinking. And the idea of the moon as the final layer, the moon's kind of like the filter for all of the other planetary influence. And whether that influence reaches the Earth, and in what way it reaches the Earth, how is that influence going to finally be brought down to us? The moon is the sort of the governor of that. So it's absolutely crucial. The moon is almost like the gatekeeper, you know?
Right.
And so from that perspective, it makes total sense. And you read, like, I really wanted to read out Sol's first aphorism on this.
Please do.
Just to demonstrate just how important the moon was to people in medieval astrology. So Solomon Bisher wrote 50 aphorisms that are like handy, like guidelines or just things to keep in mind when you're practicing astrology. And they were particularly focused on horary astrology. But it's noteworthy that the very first aphorism in the set of 50 is about the moon. And all he does really is just ram home how important the moon is. That's the first aphorism is literally just, hey, the moon's important. Make sure you don't forget about the moon. And so it goes like this. I'll try and do it justice. He says, know that the indicator, that is the moon, is the nearest of the planets of the celestial circle to the Earth, and is the most similar of the planets to the affairs of the world. Do you not see that man appears small, then grows big, and then is made complete? Likewise the moon. So take her as the indicator for every affair. And her health is the health of everything, and her corruption the corruption of everything. and she hands her management over to the first one she encounters and is connected to, because it accepts what she has handed over to it. And she is the bearer for these planets and the conciliator between two of them, and the transferer from one of them to the other. So, you're left in no doubt that in Sal's mind, the moon is the most important thing. And the fact that he put that first is meaningful and important. So it's really hard to underplay how important the moon is to medieval astrology. I just think it's crucial that we understand what the moon does from the medieval astrological perspective before we can really start playing with it. We need to understand how crucial it is.
Yeah.
And the role it has of, like I said, being the gatekeeper for all the other planets, and opening the door and allowing different planetary influences to reach us here on Earth. And that role of the transferer or the transmitter, picking up messages, like going from door to door and picking up a letter and then dropping it off at another person's house. The moon has that role. It's like the postman of the planets.
Yeah. I love those. I love those like transfer of light, collection of light aspect additions that come in the medieval tradition, which adds this element of like movement and dynamism. And I think it's so interesting. And I do think I just want to comment as well that the 50 aphorisms, I don't know how this is typically structured, but in Ben Dyke's translation of Saul, it's like the introduction, which has a lot of general astrological information, but kind of horary focused information.
Yeah.
And then the 50 aphorisms, and then on questions, which is like an explicitly horary text, but they kind of like all get grouped together. And so I do think that because Saul is like one of the first astrologers that kind of like codifies horary in a sense, like kind of brings everything together. Like it makes a lot of sense that that first aphorism focuses on like the moon may not be sufficient, but it's necessary given how important in horary the moon is, just like it's so important in electional. It's like we spoke on one of the last episodes about like you can't have a good election if you don't have the moon in good condition, and it's also very hard for a horary question to be affirmed if the moon is void or maltreated or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's like a deal breaker. There's something fundamental about the moon. It's always to be referred to, always to be checked, and its testimony always to be taken very seriously. I think part of that, like you mentioned, is the dynamic quality of horary astrology, where in order to do questionary astrology or horary astrology, the old astrologers invented a system where they would look at aspects of planets moving towards aspects and completing them, and then separating from them and moving away, and that focus on where are the planets headed, what aspect are they going to make next, and using the sort of the future destination of the planets to predict future events. That idea, when you apply that to the system of astrology, then the moon is elevated and becomes an even more important planet because it moves so fast compared to the other planets. Like if you're going to give significance to the motions of the planets and where they're going to end up in the future and delineate from that, then the moon just suddenly becomes super crucial because it's undoubtedly by far the fastest planet. And it's always doing something. It's always moving from one thing to another. And so implicit in that system of horary astrology, whenever some bright spark invented it, or where Hermes Trismegistus received it from, a divine revelation, however that material came to us, the moon becomes such a crucial part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I want to talk on before we move on to speak about Gemini is this note you made about lunar calendars. And I've talked about this a few times in reference to Austin Coppock had a really great lecture at Astromagia conference a few months back about the moon and astral magic. And one thing that he was talking about that you touched on is this idea that because the moon is kind of inconsistent in the way that you talked about, because it changes, it's a great timekeeper.
Yeah.
And like we can tell what a moon cycle is very easily without doing any kind of calculation. Whereas determining what a year is based on the sun and the movement of the sun, or our movement in reference to the sun, seems to me a lot more complicated.
Yes.
And I feel like that's so interesting. Like the consistency of the sun is what gives us life, but like the inconsistency of the moon is almost like not what gives us time, but what helps us, or what helped us originally, like mark the change or the turning of time.
Yeah, I think there's something deeply important about this. Our relationship with the sun and the moon and our use of them as timekeeping tools is intimately connected with astrology. And you can't really talk about one without the other.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're absolutely right. Like to use a lunar, to use the moons, to count time using the moon is easy in some way, because all you need to do is look up and see it, and you know straight away, like, is what quarter it is, how far away we are from a new moon. You can guess that, and and then all you have to do is wait for that first little sliver, that first little crescent to appear, and you know that it's the new month.
Right.
And visually sighting the new moon and using that to initiate a new period of time is still practiced to this day. It's for example, the lunar calendar in Islam. Yeah, that first sighting of the sliver of the moon is the beginning of the month. And when I was reading about, in preparation for the course, I've been doing a lot of study about medieval astronomy and astrology in the Islamic world, and one thing that I was fascinated by was that the tables that astrologers would purchase and use for erecting horoscopes, the Zij tables, would also contain a whole lot of material that was not astrological in nature. So along with the tables that you would use to calculate the positions of planets and things like that, there would be tables for calculating like the visibility of the moon, like when will predicting when will the first sliver of the moon be visible. So someone purchasing that table could be someone who would do both, would be able, or it would be similar overlapping spheres, so similar areas of interest. Like they wouldn't put those two things together in one book if it wasn't something that the same member of the audience might be interested in. Right. So yeah, and to your point, there's something immediate and obvious about the moon. To track time with the sun, you have to notice that the sun is moving relative to the equator. You have to use like the gnomon, like that. You have to get a vertical stick, and you stick it in the ground, and you notice, well, what height is the shadow? How long is the shadow today? And then mark that, and then in a few months' time, you can set the same up in the same place and see that the sun has actually moved, and you can notice that the sun is moving. But you have to use some simple instruments to do that, and you have to and that's why we get these monuments like Stonehenge. People are trying to track the sun, right? It's more tricky, but the moon is very obvious and easy. And between the tension between the two, the ease of tracking the moon, but the more complicated way of tracking the sun, and when people started to notice that there are roughly 12 or 13 moons in a solar year, you start to get the building blocks of astrology, really, the idea of 12 signs. And in some ways the zodiac signs are, yes, they're sort of the houses of the sun as it moves through the ecliptic, but they're also in some ways marking the moon cycle, the full moons, right? Or how many moons there are in a year as well. It's interesting to think about the zodiac as like lunar. But it has that baked in as well.
Yeah. What does the sign of Gemini mean to you?
Yeah, I was thinking, this is what I spent most of my time thinking about in the lead up to this.
Oh, interesting. Wonderful.
Okay, what's my view on Gemini? What is my take on Gemini? Or like, what can I add to the conversation about Gemini? My initial thought was a kind of reactionary one of like, let's talk a little bit about the difference between how we think about signs today versus how we think about how people thought about signs in the medieval world.
Love it.
To get into what I feel about Gemini, because I think one trouble we have as astrologers today in 2023 is that we can't help but be modern astrologers, and we can't help but be children of the time that we live in. And so even someone like myself, who's spent a lot of time trying to understand older forms of astrology, I still exist within the milieu of someone living in the 21st century, you know. So so my view of a zodiac sign is inevitably going to be colored by my current, you know, the culture and the world that I live in today. So I have like a sun signy, if you like, view of Gemini, like what you might call like a contemporary take on the sign, where I will say, you know, we think of the signs today as having personalities associated with them, particularly, and the characters to them. You know, like Aries it might represent someone who's very speedy or very bold or impetuous, or Taurus, someone who's very, you know, stable, or, you know, stuck in their ways, or has an aesthetic quality to them, etc. If you read the old medieval textbooks, the signs don't really have these well-rounded personalities to them. Like, you don't encounter it in the texts, and it will be probably one of the most striking things if you, as a modern person, if you pick up a medieval textbook on astrology, you'll be flicking through it trying to find the part where it tells you whether you can trust a Gemini, or whether, you know, whether Virgos really are fussy or something like that. It's just not it's just not there, at all. And sometimes we downplay that, and we say, well, you know, sun signs has its own legitimacy, and, you know, we don't want to take it too, like, I think there's been a history in the last 30-40 years where people started to rediscover traditional astrology of being very abrasive about modern astrology, and sort of really emphasizing this stuff's not the same, and getting up on the soapbox about it, perhaps because it was just so new at the time that people needed to do that. But those conversations have been happening for about 30 years now, with people saying, well, you know, modern astrology is like this, but traditional astrology is like this. You know, it kind of reminds me of those like hackneyed jokes from like the 80s about like women are like this, but men are like this. Like that kind of, you know, like it becomes boring at some point to keep crapping on about it. But the fact still stands that there is a significant difference between the way we look at a sign today versus the way the people in the past looked at signs, you know. So in the Middle Ages, the signs were they were the context for a planet. They, in and of themselves, the meaning that they had was relatively limited. You know, they would and the meaning that they did have was largely derived from the planet that ruled the sign. The planets really in Middle Ages and ancient astrology were the thing. They were the focus, you know. And then the signs were like qualifiers, right? So and often the way they would qualify things was just through qualities, or just different little notes about what sets this sign apart from another sign. You know, what makes Gemini different from Taurus. And when you read the medieval textbooks, they'll just list these qualities. So, you know, when you read a medieval textbook about Gemini, it will just say things like Gemini is a double-bodied sign, it's an air sign, it's a human sign, it's a sterile sign, it's a voiced sign, you know, and then they'll sort of move on, you know, and it leaves you quite, you know, as a modern person, you're like, that's not enough. Like,
what does humane mean?
Yeah.
What does sterile mean in reference to a sign?
Yeah. And it doesn't, and then they'll might list, well, and then here are the countries that this sign's associated with. Like, and they'll list a few different countries, or they might give you some colors and things like that, or places, you know. Abu Masha listed a bunch of places that each sign is associated with, like both around the house and then also just out in the world. And it's just very different to what you would encounter in a modern textbook. If I picked up a modern astrology textbook about Gemini, it would spend a lot of time talking about my personality and my character and things. It's just not present. And so as an astrologer today in the 21st century who studied this material, when someone asks you, what does Gemini mean? I have this internal issue where I'm like, well, on the one hand, I can talk a heap about what I think Gemini means in terms of character and personality. But then how much of that is rooted in the tradition versus how much of that is sort of like the contemporary approach. And I
Yeah.
have this constant problem because when I first started studying astrology, my intention was to study medieval astrology, and I really wasn't interested at all in what people were doing today. It didn't interest me. I
Hmm.
was the historical perspective again, you know.
Yeah.
So it's left me in a funny spot. So when people talk about, well, what's the sign Gemini mean to me, I have to think about those qualities primarily, you know.
Right.
So the double body quality
Hmm.
means that Gemini is very has a multitudinous, manifold quality to it.
Yeah.
It signifies many things. It signifies complexity. It
Mm.
signifies, you know, a variety,
Mm.
something being more than one. And
If I may really quickly,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
reminded with the double-bodied uh, nature of Gemini. I was recently watching a lecture by Ali Alomi. I don't remember which one it was, but he was talking about temperament and why ultimately within the medieval Islamic tradition, the tropical zodiac kind of won out, or
Mm,
was
mm,
more widely used because kind of everything became about temperament. And to give the proper prescriptions to do medical, to do
mm,
medicine and medical astrology, you needed to know about temperament, and that was kind of rooted in the seasons and the season's coldness or dryness or what have you. And so I just think about seasonality in reference to
mm,
modality, and just that kind of double-bodied nature, not necessarily being a body, but being a confluence of things.
yes.
Like
Yeah.
Gemini, for example. I actually can't think about where it is off the top of my head. It's right before it's right before Cancer.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm like, it's that mixture of spring and summer that are
Mm-hmm.
coming in. So
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean to have the confluence of these different elements and different things, rather than just the cardinality of Cancer with its
Mm-hmm.
movement in one direction of the coldness and wetness of water, or what have you,
Mm.
or the connotations that come with summer.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think and Gemini, out of all the double-bodied signs, because every mutable sign that ends a
Mm-hmm.
season has that quality of
Yeah.
being double-bodied or mutable, and it blends the qualities of the previous season with the one that's coming in. And I do feel like just because the image of Gemini is the twins,
Mm.
there's an added emphasis on that double-bodiedness. Like, you know, you could say Gemini is the most double-bodied of the double-bodied signs,
Right.
just because not only is it just a double-bodied sign, it also the imagery of the sign as well just seems to underscore that
Mm-hmm.
and bring it out
Mm.
more to the fore. You know, so I think that double-bodied nature of Gemini is really important. And my own experience of having a Gemini moon, which is probably moving into the next question, but
Mm-hmm.
is a profound experience throughout my life of having to reconcile conflicting things and
Mm.
having conflicting or um, having multitudes within me,
Yeah.
having contradictory or seemingly contradictory components to my personality or my life in lots of different ways, and having to wear two hats or wear
Mm.
multiple hats or be a different person for different people.
Mm.
And it's a intimate experience of reconciling opposites and reconciling contrasting components of my life and of the world, and
Mm.
holding things in tension. I think is an important Gemini experience, like figuring out how to hold things in tension, figuring out how to navigate between worlds, figuring out how to wear different hats,
Mm.
not because you enjoy it, but because you sort of have to, or you find yourself having to do that. You
Right.
know, I think one of the more unfair things people say about Gemini is that they're double, you know, two faced or something. This nonsense.
Right.
I think any sign can be two faced. You know, that's a
Mm-hmm.
negative. That's just a negative personality trait that
Mm.
everyone can tap into
Yeah.
if they choose to. With Gemini, I feel like there's it's almost like that's just the environment that you're in. You're in
Right.
if a planet's in Gemini, it's in a space where it's having to deal with contrast and conflict and difference
Mm.
and reconciling that or moving through it and finding a path between or a path through a middle ground
Mm.
or how to mix two different things together well.
Yeah.
It comes up again and again and again, both internally and externally.
Do you think it's fair, or do you
Mm,
think that it's likely that medieval astrologers thought about zodiac signs as places rather than this kind of psychologizing element that we
yeah,
can bring in?
yeah. You mean like how Abu Masha might say like, oh, Sagittarius might represent like a hillside or something like that, that
Yeah,
kind of
just like
thing.
a
Yeah,
kind of
yeah, a
environment,
place. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think that's one of the interesting things about how do I put this? I want to be generous here. So I
Mm-hmm.
think I think psychological astrology, or the emphasis of astrology, that over the last 50, 60, 70 years, there's been a lot of emphasis on using astrology for psychological purposes, psychoanalytical purposes, or just people approaching astrology through the lens of depth psychology. And I think there's been some fascinating work in that field. And like one of my important teachers is Mark Jones,
Mm,
who's teaching me counseling skills.
yeah.
And he comes. So there's a huge amount of value for astrologers in studying psychological astrology, because they have spent a lot of time thinking about the dynamics of between the astrologer and the client and how to
Right.
navigate that. It's really, really useful material. I think the perhaps what you lose, or what you when you turn the dial up in one area, you have to turn the dial out down in another
Right.
area, right?
Right.
So by turning the dial up on psychology and character, you inevitably have to kind of turn the dial down on the external manifestation of astrology. What's really
Right.
interesting when you look at the medieval books and you see them say things like for example, Scorpio is associated with ruined places, like a
Mm,
like a tumbled down castle, something like
right.
that, or an abandoned building. Um, the concept that the idea that astrology can encompass so many things, from like the location of a lost object to like the ruined building down the road, to what's happening inside your mind. There's a holistic quality to astrology. In some ways, astrology is the study of the unity of everything.
Mm,
Not to put too great a pedestal, something on too great a pedestal, but that is what it is. What we're doing is we're looking at the correlation between celestial events, human and down to earth events,
yeah.
earthly events, and then we're recognizing that there is a unity, and that they move together, they dance together. And
Right.
as a little treat, as a bonus, sometimes we get to stare at that long enough and hard enough that we can even look at what's going to happen next. What's the next step in the dance?
Right.
We can, and that's not the purpose of astrology. In some ways, that's just like the bonus.
Hmm.
Like what we're really doing as astrologers is enjoying being able to witness this
Right.
unity, and
Yeah.
study it and record it, and then pass that on so that more people can continue to enjoy witnessing the unity of everything, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes when we focus only on like character or psychology, we sometimes lose sight of the fact that that's what we're doing with astrology. Is we're not Astrology is not just a tool for a one thing or another thing.
Right.
It's such a vast subject, because what we're claiming is that everything moves together in step.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's why Abu Masha says it's the greatest science and the most
Hmm.
important, like the
Hmm.
most elevated.
Yeah.
And today, like a scientist might laugh at that, but
Hmm.
from the medieval perspective, it's absolutely justified, because he's saying everything, everything that like, medicine is a good subject. He even goes into this in the books. If you read it, if you read Abu
Hmm.
Masha, he says medicine's a really important subject, because you can study this thing and you can help people and heal them. And you're looking at the body and you're learning about the wonder of creation, of God's, like, the how amazing it is that the human body is so complex and everything. But he says astrology is above that, because it encompasses all of medicine,
Right.
and it has like an explanatory quality, or like yeah, it sort of was like the universal field theory of its day. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? It sort of encompassed everything.
And
Um,
I wrote my senior thesis in college on unified social science theory before I
mm,
ever came close to finding or discovering astrology. So it's not
yeah,
lost on
yeah,
me when people talk about astrology as a unified theory of everything,
mm,
why I am so attracted to it. Because
mm-hmm,
I think I kind of crave that kind of systematic thinking about things.
mm-hmm, yeah. So moving into like the moon in Gemini and what that means. Like I feel like that there's always something, like I mentioned it earlier, that reconciliation of opposites, the
Mm-hmm.
reconciliation of difference is such an important factor. Um, one keyword I really like for the moon that I come back to again and again, and I will give credit to one of my teachers and friends um, for this keyword is Julianne Evans, who's at Canberra, an astrologer.
Okay.
She's not very active on the internet or anything like that, but she's a local astrologer who I attend her house, and we have astrology circles and things there. And she gave me this keyword of the moon. The moon means needs. That's her keyword for the moon, and I thought that's such a powerful keyword because it unlocks so much. There's so much potential in that word need.
Right.
So what does someone need when their moon is in Gemini? That's kind of my inroad thinking about this. Like, what do I need in order to be happy and fulfilled and contented in life, or to feel at peace? And for Gemini, I think variety is a really important thing for the moon. I think the moon's already flitting around a lot and changing. Instead of the moon's nature to seek out new things. In Gemini, it ramps that up even further, because it's that the double-bodied nature of Gemini just creates a space where the moon is even more inclined to moving from one thing to another. Also, the fact that Gemini is ruled by Mercury adds a curiosity. I think curiosity is a really important keyword for Mercury.
Right.
The planet of the student, and the period in someone's life where Mercury takes hold, according to the ages of Ptolemy, is the period where we're at school. And so I think the eternal student archetype is an important one for people with prominent Gemini placements. And for me, certainly, like I'm always learning, and it's what I do for fun. So like for relaxation, I put on a podcast and learn about something, or I read a book. When I have headphones in my ears, it's usually because I'm listening to something, and it's usually something that I'm learning about, like history or philosophy or religion or something that interests me. I'm absorbing new info, and that's fun to me.
Yeah.
Without it, I get upset. I remember once I visited my girlfriend at the time was in America, and I didn't bring a great many books, and I was incredibly bored with American TV because I couldn't find, like, where's the channel where they just show documentaries and things all the time, and there isn't one. I need to watch the news, like good news, and I need documentaries, and I couldn't find it on American TV, so it left me very, like, I recognized that there was something missing. I needed that to be happy, like. And then, like, Mercury communication. So being, as you can tell, this has been I'm a very enthusiastic talker, and the need for communication, I think, is a really important one for Gemini, not only because it's a mercurial sign, but also because it's an air sign. So either way,
that humane social quality. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, because Gemini, when the ancient astrologers, the medieval astrologers, talked about Gemini being a human sign or a rational sign, they meant that engaging in intellectual activity, and particularly communicating ideas, are like sort of uniquely human things from their perspective. So the human signs, the signs that have a human figure, which includes all the air signs, but also Virgo and Aquarius. Sorry, Aquarius is already an air sign, but Virgo and might be, I think the first half of Sagittarius, maybe.
Yes.
They
say the first half is of, I forget how the quote goes, but yeah, you're correct.
Yeah, that's right. And so those kinds of signs just really enjoy intellectual things and communication of ideas and learning, and most Sagittarians and Geminis have that. There's something that those signs share, is that kind of like passion for knowledge, and like what have you been reading recently? What have you been learning about? Usually a good conversation starter for those signs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't have any Gemini placements, but I do have I have Sag rising and a bunch of Sag placements. So I definitely understand that, like, love of learning, but from like perhaps maybe like a little bit of a different flavor. I think the interesting thing about your chart as well is that you're an Aries rising, and you have Mars in the house of its joy, correct? In Virgo.
That's right. I have a lot of rejoicing planets, actually. So I have Aries rising, Mars in Virgo, so the 6th house. I have the moon in Gemini in the 3rd house, so it's rejoicing there, and I have the sun in the 9th house rejoicing there too.
Wow.
Remember, I think that's it though. I don't think I have any more rejoicing planets, but pretty cool. I always thought that was like a bit of a bit of a brag for among traditional astrologers that I've
I
got all
don't
these
know if
planets. And
if I've
yeah,
seen anybody else's chart with that many planets in joy. It's
yeah,
pretty cool.
it's funny. And I was trying to think like, how do I interpret that? Because it's funny because Chris actually put this to me when we were preparing for a previous lecture. He was like, "So how do you interpret joy? Do you think that's like a dignity?" And the
Mm.
way that Chris does, when Chris asks you a question, you feel put on the spot. You're like, "Oh God, I have to have I have to have like the quote unquote correct answer here."
Yeah.
Because you know he already has his answer.
Yeah.
You know, and I was like, yeah, I don't know. I found myself struggling because I couldn't think of a reference, clear and strong reference in the medieval textbooks that I was reading about
Right.
what you're supposed to do when a planet's in joy, or how that changes your interpretation. They mention
Mm.
it, but then they don't really say like, and here's what it means like practically. Like
Right.
Saul includes it in the introduction.
Mm-hmm.
Towards the end, after he's listed all the planets, all the strengths and weaknesses of the planets and the moon, he just mentions like, oh, there's also all these rejoicing conditions, and he lists them out.
Oh yeah, I was reading
Um,
that today. Yeah.
and but he doesn't say like, and this is, and what here's what it means when the moon's in its joy or something like that. He just lists it and then moves on, which is
Right.
frustrating. I tend to think it must be positive. I think it must be positive. I think
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's good for the planet, not necessarily for the person. Might be the way of interpreting it.
I think especially with the malefic joys, I think
Yeah.
with Mars in the sixth, there can add an element of like Mars likes to act, and the sixth house can be, I know it can have these connotations with illness and
Yeah.
subservience, but I think
I've
there's
noticed that
also
too.
like this action oriented thing with the sixth house that Mars is good with. But I think Saul does say that Mars and Saturn joy in sorrowful things, which is why they joy in the 12th and 6th.
Yeah,
So it is a little
yeah.
tough to delineate.
It is tricky. I have found a couple of things with like the Mars in the sixth house. Like I have had experience for most of my life of being in like a subservient role or being like an underling at work rather than being like in a managerial or supervisory role. I've tended to be beneath people and taking orders. And it's just a theme in my life I found is I tend to also, apart from in intellectual fields where I really want to grab the microphone, you know, but if I'm not in like an intellectual field, I don't want to be in charge. I actually hate being in charge. Like it's one thing, and that another like area where I've had to grapple with like dichotomy or like contradiction is in the way that I moonlight as an astrologer, but in my day job I'm a public servant. I don't want to get into like
Right.
exactly what I do because it's a government
Sure.
job and I don't want to out myself. But so by day I am a diligent, you know, civil servant, a fairly low level one, and then at night I like don this sort of weird position of like authority almost in like this field that's very strange. And you know, in my niche, I am a niche micro internet celebrity or whatever.
Uh-huh.
You know, it's funny because like yeah, there's a dichotomy between people sort of listening to you and well, what's Rob has to say about this astrological thing, and then on the other hand going to work and turning to other people and being, well, what do you want me to do today, boss? You know,
Yeah.
right, I surrender, I have no authority, or I surrender any position of like authority. So yeah, it's funny how you have to flip between those two. But I think Mars in the sixth house, having the ruler of my ascendant in the sixth house, just gives me an experience of subservience in a lot of different areas of my life, or having to put other people's needs before my own, or you know, the experience of a servant or indeed a slave is of swallowing your own needs and swallowing what you feel and what you want to do, and your emotional, like, you know, what would you rather be doing right now? I'm afraid you can't think about that. You have to do the thing that the task that you've been given.
Right.
So it's like a limiting quality. There's a limiting quality to, I think, prominent planets placed in the sixth, and a kind of a subservient experience that you get. That being said, like I do feel there's an interventionist quality to having Mars in the sixth that hopefully could be positive for my health. Generally speaking, I do see the manifestation of like my chart ruler, a malefic planet in the sixth house, as in like I create my own health problems. I injure myself. I have injured myself a lot over my life, and I like have different times had like a lot of bad habits. Like I smoked cigarettes for many years. You know, I still struggle with my vices. You know,
Yeah.
but and so I do see the negative side of it. But what is the rejoicing quality of Mars in the sixth is something that's hard for me to put my finger on. It might be that just Mars is having a good time making me hurt myself, you know? or symbol, or, you know, to be less causal, Mars is symbolizing a tendency in my life
Yeah.
to to injure myself or be my own worst enemy in some way.
Hmm.
Yeah. But moon in the third, I think is I can see the more positive aspect of the moon in its joy. So
Right.
I do feel like if the moon is so important to our emotional side of our personality, um, or like for example in the medieval tradition, when they were analyzing character, they would look at the moon and Mercury primarily,
Yeah.
replacements and aspects of the moon and Mercury as the inroad to someone's character. So the moon was important, and the moon was the more in, instinctive part of the human being. The Mercury part would be the more rational part.
Right.
Um, so when people would look at the moon and Mercury, they would assign emotions and instincts and more of that felt experience to the moon, and the more
Hmm.
detached, rational part of our experience to Mercury. So
Right.
my moon, I always say the moon is the heart. That's one of my, even
Mm.
though the sun is technically the heart in terms
Hmm.
of medical astrology, certainly when you compare the moon and Mercury in this technique of character analysis, I would say that Mercury is the brain and moon is the heart. You know, like the moon
Yeah.
is that part that the part that seeks out and
Yeah.
has desire. You know,
Mm.
my moon is desiring, um, um, engagement, intellectual engagement, Gemini. You know, conversation, variety. And it's also really happy there. You know, it's
Hmm.
loving being there, and I tend to find that I'm quite a bubbly person, or I have like a even when life gets hard, I tend to have like a happy go lucky kind of way about me.
Hmm.
So something the moon enjoys being in the third house, perhaps because it is a place of change that all the quadrant, or sorry, all the houses that are sorry, the falling houses, the cadent houses.
Right.
I was looking for the word. Um, have a change quality to them, you know. And Saul says the cadent houses are not good, except if the question is about like someone running away or
Yeah.
traveling, then it's good to have a planet
I
in
was
the
reading this section
yeah
today too. Yeah.
yeah right. And so I feel like, why does the moon rejoice in the third house? Well, firstly, because it's the symbol of the goddess, and there's that whole goddess aspect to the
Right.
third house. But apart from that, you know, if we're going to sort of think creatively, perhaps part of it is that the third house is a place that represents change and movement,
Hmm.
because of its cadent quality. Also, its association with journeys and
Right.
communication, and the moon is also a planet that's associated with journeys and associated with communication.
Mm.
So the moon loves to be in that place of trading ideas, flitting about, moving between the third house is like the house of the neighborhood, you know,
Right.
moving between people's houses,
Yeah.
carrying messages, being part of the conversation.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, again, that 28-day cycle compared to that 365-day cycle with the moon in the third, the short distance travel, the local environment, and the sun in the ninth, joining there, being kind of like that once in a lifetime religious pilgrimage that you take, that
mhm.
kind of larger cycle, kind of
Yeah,
more long distance travel.
I think there's a lot
Yeah.
to that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something about the metacosmic nature of the Caden houses, the internal nature, and the moon's like kind of, as we've talked about, association with horary, with electional, and with magic. It's kind of
Mhm.
like, what are those kind of rituals that can bring about that internal shift that can bring you into that kind of metacosmic space?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because we're talking about Gemini and what the moon in Gemini means, and we talked about how intimate the moon is in terms of it being like representing the heart of someone, or like the most deep animal layer of someone, you know,
Mm,
the instincts. And one thing I've found, and it's interesting that I'm recording this today after having coming back from that concert I went to with my brother, is that the moon in
right.
the third house, I do feel like I have a very strong loving relationship with my brother,
Hmm.
which is a little unusual, I think, sadly, for like two heterosexual white guys who were born in the 80s, but we are really, really close. Like
Yeah.
I've rarely seen siblings who are as close as me and my brother, like male, white, heterosexual, cisgender guys. Like we don't often have this kind of close, loving relationship where we message each other
Right.
and say, I love you, bro, and you know, and checking in with each other regularly, having like heart to hearts. deep and meaningfuls, if you like
That's
really
beautiful.
regularly.
Yeah.
And having the moon there is, I think, a really big part of that.
Hmm.
I love him so much. He's such an important part of my soul. But at the same time, it's interesting that the sign of the twins um, is the symbol of brothers, right? Like Castor and
Right.
Pollux are the two twins, the divine twin, and they're like the original odd couple
Mm.
because one is immortal and the other is mortal.
Mm.
And I do feel like me and my brother have this like odd couple thing, where it's a bit different. Like he's not like one of us isn't immortal, but but like he's like I'm kind of like the white collar like office job guy. He's like the blue collar guy.
Mm.
I've got no tattoos. He's covered in tattoos. He speaks like more like working class because he's been in those environments, and
Right.
I speak more like a middle class Australian guy,
Hmm.
and but we're so close, and even though
Yeah.
we have that difference, we have some shared things that we just always love. So hip hop was one of those things. So it was really great to go with him
Mm.
and see Wu-Tang and Nas and like enjoy that shared love that we have. Um, so I do feel like that odd couple thing is interesting how it comes up in my chart with the moon in Gemini. I might just be a unique manifestation for me, but for other people who might have moon in third or moon in Gemini, think about siblings and if that unlocks a new perspective on your chart or a new way of digging into or encountering siblings in the chart, then like maybe that's useful for people
Yeah.
listening to think about.
Absolutely.
Because I found that myth really resonant, yeah.
Mm.
And throughout my life, I'm not really a myth guy much. I'm not really a mythology guy, but for some reason, Castor and Pollux stay in my mind. I remember I was living at this old house, um, and across the lake from my house, I got this great view of the city skyline, and they were building a skyscraper, and there were these two big cranes, and they were
Hmm.
lit up at night with all these lights. It looked quite pretty. Had these two cranes, like, and I could just sit on my veranda and like look out and see them, have a cup of coffee, and I named them Castor and Pollux for some
Oh,
reason. Those
nice.
two cranes, and I don't know why I did that. I think I was just being like someone who's into the classics and just likes doing that kind of thing.
Hmm.
But it was sad when I took them down. I was actually bummed out when they took them down. But Castor and Pollux for some reason lives in my mind rent free. Anyway,
Mm.
wanted to mention that.
Amazing.
And then the last thing I wanted to squeeze in, which I thought it was a really good question, and it made me think a lot, was you asked like, is the moon an important part of my spiritual practice? And I had to sort of sit with that and think about it for a little while. And I think I've got a complex answer to that, which
Yeah.
I'll try to get through quickly, which is that like, yeah, I have the part of me. This is again talking about like reconciling opposites and things. I have the part of me that's interested in magic and interested in um, planetary magic in particular. And so I entertain the idea of the planets being ensouled beings that
Mm.
have like a spirit or an angel or a demon or whatever you want to call it
Yeah.
that we can call upon and we can have a relationship with, that you can interact with, that we can draw down into a physical object, you know. Um, and then at the same time, I have to hold that intention with the fact that like I'm a practicing Christian. I'm a sort of an unusual kind of Christian. I think you would agree,
Mm.
but but like I'm a monotheist on some level, like
Mm.
probably a heterodox one or an
Yeah.
unorthodox one, but and then I have to kind of reconcile the Christian mysticism that I have
Mm.
with my interest in magic, and sometimes that can feel tense, because I do think that there is a relationship to be had there. Let's say,
Yeah.
um, but at the same time, it's like a big no-no. Not when you, it's all about worship. I think at the end of the day, like, are you worshiping the spirit
Hmm.
or are you worshiping God? Like, because
Mm.
that was the dilemma that medieval people had when they were encountering this material.
Right.
But what made me feel a little bit happier was realizing that the author of the Picatrix clearly was himself grappling with this sort of stuff.
Mm.
Obviously, a Muslim, just from the text itself and like the whole context of that text is placing this astrological magical material within a Islamic framework, and discussing it from an Islamic worldview. So it's not unique for me to have to grapple with like, is this like this pagan sort of roots of astrology, if you like? the pagan, or like the how would you put it? What's the opposite of monotheistic?
Polytheistic, yeah.
Polytheistic kind of like roots and
Mm-hmm.
soil of astrology. That's where this plant grew.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have is the long history of people coming along and picking that up and framing it within their own particular cultural or religious or spiritual perspective.
Mm.
And I'm sort of part of that process. And that feels very Gemini as well to me, of like reconciling two conflicting or contrasting parts of myself,
Mm.
but finding a way to do that feels not only that I can live with, but actually is inspirational, and
Yeah.
actually sort of like propels me forward.
Yeah.
So rather than it being a problem, it becomes a source
Mm.
of inspiration and wonder. And I think turning contradiction and conflict into something that's valuable,
Mm.
and finding like the whole that can be greater than the sum of its parts, so to speak. Like that's part of what Gemini is all about, is that reconciliation process.
Mm.
Mm,
That's super beautiful. Thank you
yeah.
for sharing that, Rob. I hope this isn't like a trite comparison, but I feel like I'm picking up something here with this idea of like you get butterflies in your stomach, and you can I think the normal reaction to getting butterflies in your stomach or getting nervous and having that guttural feeling is to be like, I don't want to feel this.
Mm,
I want to push this away. And I think that can happen intellectually with tension between these kinds of ideas that seem disparate or seem like they can't coexist. And I found that like if I can embrace that feeling that comes up when I feel butterflies in my stomach, I can actually use it as a fuel to propel me forward. And I feel like you're speaking to a similar thing of like, this doesn't have to be something that shuts me down. It doesn't have to be something that stops me in my tracks. It can be something that can propel my desire to know, my thirst for knowledge and, mystical union or communion. It can propel that forward. It can be fuel for that. And I think that that's such an awesome place to get to.
I really resonate with that a lot. And like it's the way that the engine doesn't work until the fuel is mixed with air, and then the explosion can occur. Like sometimes things have to be combined or tempered before something truly magical can happen.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I know you have to run because you have Mother's Day duties to attend to. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on. Any closing thoughts you want to share with us? Where can we find you? Is there anything that you're working on that you want to let us know about?
I'll do a quick few plugs. So my website's oldschooolastrology.com, and that's where you can find the blog that I update intermittently, as well as links to get a reading from me. There's also some information about the course that I'm teaching with Chris Brennan on my website now. The course itself, as I mentioned earlier, is available for early access now, so you can get in at what I think we can all agree is a bit of a steal of a price.
Absolutely.
And get access to the old course content that Chris recorded 10 years ago, along with the new material that we're recording. Roughly every month we record a new lecture and upload it to the website. So if you want to learn about horary astrology, the art of answering questions using astrology, then the course is one way to do that. So you can find out more about that at my website, oldschooolastrology.com.
Awesome. I'll be sure to link all that in the show notes.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Rob. And really appreciate you being here. It's been an honor and a pleasure. And I will talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. This has been really great.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.